Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout. I would like to welcome you all to the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake, and everything's falling off the podium. As you probably know, when you came in, you were hit up by the redistricting petition people. The League is very much involved in the redistricting petition, so we hope that you have, or at least will consider signing. This is simply to get redistricting on the ballot for an independent advisory commission, at which point they would offer their maps to the legislature, which then could say yes or no. This won't be on the ballot until next year, so it's well worth. We only have 115,000 signatures to get, so please add. Let's see, what else? We have unit meetings coming up. For those of you who are interested, you can go to our website. We are studying ranked choice voting. It's kind of difficult to understand. This is why we're studying it. So we welcome you to come to any of our unit meetings. They are listed on our website. You can go to any of those areas throughout the county. Do we have any other announcements? I think Carol Strawn over there has made gerrymandering cookies, just in case you want to take a bite out of redistricting. No, they're really lovely. In November, we have a couple of events coming up in November. One of them is a panel on intergenerational poverty. This is another really, of course, everything we do is a really important issue. Have you noticed? Intergenerational poverty is something that's being studied now in Utah. Vicki Samuelson has been in charge of getting us a fantastic panel, so I hope you'll consider coming to that. We have not yet set a date for another event in November, at which time the League from Washington, D.C. will be coming to explain to us why they should be a state. You may want to discuss that too. At that event, we're hoping to have all of the petitions. There presently will be 5 petitions before the public in Utah, all to be put on the ballot next year, and they'll all be there. Right now, I'd like to present Dr. Tim Chambless. He is an associate, or was an associate professor and lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah, and he was the academic outreach coordinator for Hinckley Institute. Are you still that?
I am until October 30th.
Until October 30th, at which time he retires. He's taught university classes in American national government and political parties, state and local government, as well as law and politics, controversial legal issues, and constitutional law. We are all about constitutional legal issues. He's taught 4 university departments: political science, history, communications, and English Language Institute. For 15 years, he handled the Constitution telecourse, which was seen statewide on KUEN TV. Each year since 1994, he has led a unique undergraduate student seminar to Washington, D.C., during which students have met with Utah members of Congress, the justices, lobbyists, and of course, journalists. Since 2007, he's taught the current events course at the University of Utah Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Since 1982, he has taught 30,000 students, and I think some of you might be some of them. So I'm going to, this says you're a strong believer in government service. That's why he's here today, serving us. I appreciate you coming. Please welcome Dr. Tim Chambless.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm glad I can be here. I'm on a plane Sunday morning for Washington, D.C. On my birthday, Monday, I'm going to have lunch with Rich Pyatt. You might remember him from Channel 5. He's been press secretary to Congresswoman Love. And getting together and doing this in preparation for an excellent program that we're going to have May of next year, sponsored by KUER and Go Learn for news junkies in Washington, D.C. So maybe we can talk about that some more in just a little while. Let's talk about the U.S. Constitution, the basis for all U.S. law. And I might just ask you some questions, although asking you questions might violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. But I would always require my students, first exam, to know the Constitution. I would test them on it. 100 questions, multiple choice, A, B, C, D, E, the 7 articles, the 27 amendments, different aspects of those amendments in different sections of the Constitution itself. I want to highlight about 10, maybe 11 areas in presentation and then go to Q&A. Most of the time, I think we'll do Q&A. But want to highlight, starting off with, I want to talk about the First Amendment. Okay, the freedoms, the guarantees we have under the First Amendment, and then talk about the infamous Electoral College. That is significant, certainly very timely this past year. Third, the pardon power. Then can the president act alone when acting as his role as commander-in-chief? And fifth, how does the impeachment process actually work? How does it actually work? What is the criteria? And then I want to talk about something called emoluments, an old word from 230 years ago. Okay? Then presidential executive orders, something very timely this past year since January 20th. Then the filibuster or extended debate. What do we mean by regular order? You heard John McCain make a reference to that just a few weeks ago. Then sequestering or sequestration, and then lastly, the vetoes. And then we go to questions and answers. And I really like questions and answers. I tell my students there's no such thing as a bad question, only bad answers. But that the answers can never be known if the questions are not asked. So you have an obligation to ask those tough questions. Let's talk about a little bit about the First Amendment. Okay, remind me, I'm very forgetful. I'm going to be getting up in years here. First Amendment has what freedoms in just a few words? Religion, and religion is 2 parts. Speech, peacefully to assemble. Ah, yes, to petition your government officials for a redress of grievances, which we interpret to mean the right to lobby and the right to protest. So speech, press, maybe you hear the term media, religion, 2 parts to religion, peacefully to assemble, that's what we're doing right now, and we're going to be exercising free speech in a peaceful way, and then the right to protest, the right to lobby. So we'll come back and we'll talk about this. Second is the Electoral College. I'm going to suggest to you that it's undemocratic. I'm going to suggest to you that it's the result of a bad compromise 230 years ago. Today is 2017. If we go back 230 years to 1787, you had a committee get together in Philadelphia, 55 individuals representing 12 states, not 13. Rhode Island could not agree who to send, so they agreed to send no one. Very quickly, 14 individuals who were there at the beginning left. So that over a period of 4 months, we were really dealing with a group of 41. And that meant that someone like Alexander Hamilton alone would be representing the state of New York whenever he voted. And eventually, to get a document that is compromised, that is to say, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said that what we must accomplish a document, we must do it, compromise, compromise, and compromise without feeling compromised. With the threat of a civil war, possibly within New England, Shays' Rebellion, and then outside the English, the most powerful country in the world, surrounding the U.S., north, south, east, and west, even though an 8-year war had just ended. A second War of Independence was on the horizon. We'll call that the War of 1812. Very often I ask my students, when did the War of 1812 begin? And I get deer in the headlights. Okay. Okay. The Electoral College. The Electoral College, you remember this? It's a compromise to small states in order to get them to agree. Just like there was something called the 3/5 compromise, that will do away with as a result of a 4-year civil war. But the Electoral College we still have, because the Constitution as a committee approved it on a vote of 38-3. And in our history, since 1789, 1788 fall, we've had 45 presidents. The current president is the 45th. 5 times out of 45 times, the Electoral College has chosen the president. 5 times the individual who did not get the most votes won the election. This is very hard for me to explain to my international friends who are trying to understand democracy, Western-style democracy. How is it that the person who gets the most votes doesn't win the election? Someone who gets 2.9 million more votes isn't in the White House today. Then we look at the Electoral College as a winner-take-all system. And I look at those numbers, 306 to 232 electoral votes. That's what we had last November 8th. And I've tried to understand it, and the best comparison I can give is that we're almost at the World Series right now. My Dodgers are playing tonight as I speak. I bleed Dodger blue. And I'm in good shape. Yeah? And if we go back a year ago, who was playing in the World Series in 2016? Chicago Cubs and the Cleveland, and I'm going to say Indians, although the hat I bought last July 5th in Cleveland has a big C on it and no symbol of a Native American. But that you remember. Next question is, who won? Cubs. How many games were played? 7, very good. Now here's the question. How many runs did each team score?
You're going to say Cleveland scored more runs.
Actually, I'm going to say they each scored 27. But in that last game, it went to extra innings. And Chicago got 2 runs and Cleveland won, but they ended up both 27. So where do we draw that distinction? This is my stretching analogy to talk about the existence of the Electoral College as we live with it today in a subliminal way. Okay? We can come back to it. The presidential pardon power. I want to talk about this a little bit and use a very recent example that's close to home for us. In the Constitution, the basis for all U.S. law, the Constitution has 7 sections, and the second section is the executive branch. You probably remember this, the pardon power, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. Quote, the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the U.S. Okay? When have we seen this king-like authority issued? And by the way, we inherit this from 800 years ago. 1215, Runnymede, outside of London.
Magna Carta.
Yeah, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Okay? So that concept goes back 8 centuries. 1795, there was a little rebellion out in Ohio. We'll call it the Whiskey Rebellion. And afterwards, some folks, this is significant in our history because it's the first time that a president ordered troops into a territory or a state. George Washington, a retired general, sends troops into Ohio to tell farmers to stop converting their corn into liquid form and selling it at a higher price than keeping it in solid vegetable form. There's some men arrested, and they're convicted of treason, and they're going to be executed, and George Washington will pardon them. 1795. 1858, we're in Utah. There was something happening in Utah in 1857, 1858. What do we call it?
Utah War.
The Utah War. The Utah War. And afterwards, as part of a negotiated settlement, President Buchanan pardoned Mormons after the Utah War. Otherwise, Brigham Young had talked about a scorched earth policy. He was going to burn this whole area down and move to San Bernardino, if you know where San Bernardino is. Okay. 1921, after World War I, President Harding pardoned Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs was a socialist opposed to World War I. He was opposed to the conscription, the draft, the Espionage Act of 1917. In prison in 1912, he got 8% of the popular vote while in prison. Eugene V. Debs. President Harding pardons him in 1921. You jump ahead now half a century in 1971. Remember Jimmy Hoffa? We don't know where Jimmy Hoffa really is now. But President Nixon, getting ready to campaign for re-election, pardoned the leader of the largest labor union in the country, the Teamster Union, not the AFL-CIO, but the Teamsters. Pardoned him. And then the infamous pardon is 1974, September 8th, 1974. Remember who got pardoned that day? Richard Nixon. He had not been indicted, tried, convicted, but he received a presidential pardon. Jerry Ford will say this is the #1 reason why he'll lose the election in 1976. And we know that 1 month after the pardon, Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, was going to indict private citizen Richard Nixon, which would have been unprecedented in our history. I just read you the words about a pardon. It says, shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. Okay, the country, the government. Okay, that quote does not say any pardon the president grants is absolute and unreviewable. Now, I'm starting to be wonkish. And remember, I taught con law for years. Okay? But it's an important point because Chief Justice William Howard Taft will put forth the idea that a pardon recipient can be sued because he or she systematically violated individual constitutional rights. And I'm thinking about that because of Arizona. South of us, right above the northern border from Mexico. And the question is, can a presidential pardon be reversed? Answer is, it's unprecedented, but I think it's possible. Why am I bringing it up? Because earlier this year, a politician who was also a sheriff of a county in which the largest city in the state of Arizona resides, was convicted for criminally defying a federal court order to stop detaining immigrants on his suspicion that these folks had entered the country illegally. And I've thought about this because when I'm driving up from San Diego into Southern California, they just wave me right through. But I suspect if I was a person of color, that they'd have me pulled over to the side, and they'd be checking the trunk and so forth. Well, I'm talking about a fellow named Joseph Arpaio. And after being convicted, but still having the matter being tried, being appealed, on August 25th, President Trump pardoned Joseph Arpaio. Pardoned him, and yet Arpaio is doing something very interesting. He is continuing to appeal his federal conviction. He wants the conviction vacated. And on October 4th, this month, federal judge Susan Bolton upheld the pardon of President Trump. But therefore, the ACLU which was the plaintiff, complaining party, lost, but she did not rule on Arpaio's request to vacate the conviction. So on his record, he was convicted, but he received a pardon. Now think it through. If you accept a pardon, what is the inference? That you're guilty, that you did something wrong. Okay. So he accepted the pardon, but he wants it vacated. Now, I thought about that in comparison to a fellow named Richard Nixon, who 3 years after he left the White House, remember August 9th, 1974, on national television being interviewed by David Frost, Richard Nixon said, of course, if the president does it, it is not against the law. This is 3 years after being forced to resign. He still had that mindset. And remember, when Nixon resigned, 25% of Americans polled thought Nixon should still continue as president, and that included my parents. We had some lively discussions about this. Let's talk about impeachment for a moment. Impeachment, it appears 4 times in the U.S. Constitution. A peaceful, nonviolent way to remove a corrupt or incompetent government official. Impeachment appears 4 times. Women, woman. Anywhere to be found? No. Political parties, class I've taught for years? No. Education, nowhere to be found. Impeachment, 4 times. So, what's the definition of impeachment? If it appears 4 times in the Constitution, and the Constitution is the basis for all U.S. law, what's the definition? What's the criteria? And I heard that comment earlier, and here I come with regard to the specifics. If you look at the very end of the second article, okay, the executive branch, Article 2, Section 4, the Constitution says the criteria for the peaceful, nonviolent removal of a corrupt or incompetent government official is treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. It doesn't say personality, style, doesn't say in terms of positions, differing positions on public policy issues. So differences on politics, no. Personality, no. Treason, yes. Bribery, yes. High crimes and misdemeanors, okay? This is where folks can maybe have differing opinions. Now, the precedent I go to is not Andrew Johnson, remember the vice president after Abraham Lincoln, who was brought up on an impeachment trial and survived by 1 vote. The so-called radical black Republicans in Congress wanted the Tennessee Democrat out. They didn't want him in power, and there were 13 political charges brought up, and he was able to survive by 1 vote. And I'm not going to talk about Bill Clinton. You remember 1999, there were 4 charges. There, 2 impeachment charges. The Republican Party knew they didn't have the votes to begin with, but it was a political theater. It was very theatrical. But let's look at Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is the person I would compare to the current occupant in the White House. Richard Nixon had barely lost the election in 1960. He barely wins it in 1968. Remember, Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, and himself. And the election's not settled until 7 a.m. the morning after the night before. They've been counting votes all night. Nixon will want re-election. I'm going to suggest to you the Watergate scandal started not on June 17th, Friday night, Saturday morning of 1972. It started right after the election. In fact, arguably, the Watergate scandal started before the election in 1968 because of interference on the part of Nixon to interfere with the ongoing negotiations for peace during the war in Vietnam. Maybe we can talk about that in more detail if you want. Treason. Nixon was not involved with treason. Bribery is a stretch. High crimes and misdemeanors, yes. The form, lying to everyone. The press, the public, the Congress, the court, lying to everybody. Okay. I'm going to suggest to you the current president is testing in an unprecedented way the criteria for impeachment. That is to say, treason, and we'd like to talk to Robert Mueller, but he's got other things he's doing right now. So we'll have to talk to Robert Mueller later. But as director of the FBI for 12 years, he knows something about the law. Bribery. I'm going to suggest to you that every day since January 20th, this condition with regard to emoluments has been a violation of law. In May, I stood out in front of a hotel by the old post office on Pennsylvania Avenue. I couldn't bring myself to go in, but I stood there outside and looked at it. Realized a lot of folks were going into that place and someone was profiting from it. High crimes and misdemeanors. If we use the basis of Nixon and lying, well, I've lost count. I don't have enough fingers and toes multiplied 4 or 5 times to talk about inconsistencies, untruths, and just out lies. But we can talk about that maybe during Q&A. Anybody concerned about the status of being commander-in-chief? Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1. We've had 5 formally declared wars. The last one was the Monday morning after Pearl Harbor, so December 8th, 1941. Keep in mind, under our structure of law, the president asks Congress to declare war. Congress votes to declare war. So when I would hear President George W. Bush say he had declared war on fill in the blank, he was either speaking with hyperbole or he was speaking ignorantly. And he was commander-in-chief. Now, this position of commander-in-chief, when it really comes down to it, when push comes to shove, there's no managerial administrative constraint upon the president who wears that metaphorical hat of being commander-in-chief. Now maybe that's not dangerous in 1700s or 1800s or maybe prior to 1945. But since the nuclear age, since 1945, it's a major concern. And maybe in Q&A we can talk about North Korea as a case study. Yeah, one thing I do want to say is Senator Bob Corker, who's now not going to seek re-election in a year and a half, finishing his second term, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has said that today we are protected by former generals, the American people and the world, from possible war by 3 retired generals. One is the Chief of Staff, one is the National Security Advisor, and one is the Secretary of Defense. And I'm thinking about Richard Nixon again. Now, in the Oval Office today, there's no picture of Richard Nixon. There's a picture of Andrew Jackson, but I'm going to circle back to Richard Nixon. Okay. In 1974, Pioneer Day in Utah, July 24th, the Supreme Court 8-0, with Rehnquist abstaining, legally ordered the president to turn over the best evidence required in a criminal proceeding, secretly recorded audio tapes. Nixon all day thought about not turning those tapes over. His closest staff, for example, Pat Buchanan, Al Haig, said, "You've got to do it." When he turned it over, that best evidence, he was gone within 2 weeks. When you listen to the audio tapes, and I have copies, the President of the United States, who was a lawyer, sounds like a thug. He sounds like a criminal. He knows what he was doing. He was committing criminal wrongdoing. that would justify impeachment. In those last 2 weeks between July 24th and August 9th, he was drinking heavily, he was severely depressed, very moody. The Secretary of State, a fellow named Henry Kissinger, still alive in his 90s, and James Schlesinger, who's gone now, but Secretary of Defense, the two of them notified the Pentagon and said, if you happen to get a contact from the Commander-in-Chief about any type of military action, talk to us first. But you won't find that in the Constitution. But that was the pragmatic approach they took. Remember, was the Vietnam War still going on? Was the Cold War still going on? So that's how this matter of an unstable commander-in-chief was handled 43 years ago. Emoluments, gifts of financial favors. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8. I'll read this to you. No person holding any office of profit or trust shall, without consent of the Congress, accept of any present emolument, office or title, or any kind whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 7. Quote, the President, during the period in which he shall have been elected, shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them, which means individual states themselves. Okay? October 17th. Was that 2 days ago? October 17th in New York City, our largest city, our financial capital, a federal court had its first hearing to decide if a trial should begin to address this constitutional question. The question is about the current president and whether or not he's been violating since January 20th the emoluments clause in Article 1 and Article 2. Back on January 23rd, 3 days after January 20th, which was Inauguration Day, a lawsuit was filed in New York City by an organization called CREW, C-R-E-W, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics. And these are the plaintiffs. Who are the complaining parties? An association of restaurants and workers in New York City, an events booker of events in Washington, D.C., and an owner of a number of hotels and restaurants in New York City. Who's the defendant? The Justice Department, headed by a fellow named Jeff Sessions. Okay? Question, do critics of President Trump have legal standing to sue? That was the question addressed yesterday and today. First off, in a case like this, you have to have standing. Do you have a case or controversy? Do you have, is this a significant case? Are there two adversarial parties? So they're going to determine that. If indeed standing to sue is granted, then they're going to have to define what emolument is, because we're in 2017, we're not in 1787. So what constitutes a gift, a present, and from whom? Okay, king, prince, not so much we're concerned with, but a foreign state. And can that be intangible? Not quantifiable, but intangible, like agreements. A fundamental question is, can a democracy survive if a president assumes office while seeking financial gain and using wealth to persuade? Repeat that to you again. Can a democracy survive if a president assumes office while seeking financial gain and using wealth to persuade? Admittedly, the current president is getting wealthy from the people who are enjoying his restaurants, his hotels, so forth, maybe the Trump Tower in downtown Manhattan, because of who he is and the power he has access to. So this is an important case. It's the first time in our history that these two emoluments clauses are being tested in court. There are no previous precedents. And as you might imagine, the plaintiffs, the complaining parties, they want a broad definition. The Justice Department wants a very narrow definition. So we'll see what happens. If indeed the trial continues, then we move to the discovery stage. And I find this very intriguing, because if you get to the discovery phase, it means that in this case, the current president's going to have to turn over by court order documents and financial records for the trial. He's going to have to turn over business records, potentially his tax returns, foreign government payments, and state government payments, things that he promised he would do during the campaign and has decided since he entered the Oval Office not to do so. Okay, I'll move from this to executive orders. Have you heard about executive orders? Okay. You have a gentleman in the White House who says he has done more as president than any other president ever in our history. When I test my students on the most significant presidents and the least significant presidents, we talk about probably Abraham Lincoln. I'm talking off surveys of constitutional scholars, political scientists, constitutional historians, and this has been compiled by C-SPAN, and hundreds of folks who have made it their careers to study this. So we look at Abraham Lincoln, we look at George Washington, and we look at Franklin Roosevelt as being the three most significant. Why? Think of the challenges they had to face. And then if we talk about least significant, we usually think about the fellow I mentioned earlier, James Buchanan. Remember the Utah War? He was really bad. And basically he was bad because he was impotent, he was inert, he was neutral, and so he did nothing. So Abraham Lincoln, elected, has to wait 4 months before taking office. And boy, did he inherit a mess. Then we talk about Herbert Hoover, just prior to Franklin Roosevelt. Okay? Then that third one, and here's where you get some argument, because there's almost a schizophrenic split here, is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon on domestic policy, a disaster. What he did threatened the continuance, the survival of this country. On foreign policy, if you start talking about détente and perestroika and rapprochement, then maybe you can make some significant arguments the other way. So right now, it's always too early to judge presidents who are still alive, and we have 4 former presidents who are still alive. So it's tough to judge them, because people who know a lot, they haven't written their books yet. Okay? And they usually will say things after the person has passed away. But we have somebody in the White House right now who's really testing the boundaries of success or failure. What's an executive order in contrast to a law? You know what a law is? And I'm jumping ahead of myself if I talk about regular order. Okay, it's something right out of a textbook. But what is an executive order? Good and loud. No approval by Congress. That's right. That's right. No approval by Congress. Okay. Executive orders. It's an inferred power that the courts have upheld. Because if you read your Constitution, Article 2 is fairly short. The longest article is the first article. Article 1, the legislative article. We think the Founding Fathers, the framers of the Constitution, thought that the lawmakers, House and Senate, they were the important guys. The president was simply a manager and administrator. Presidents have some unilateral powers. One we've talked about already, the pardon power. But keep in mind, the president, according to the Constitution, is the commander-in-chief on foreign policy, and he's the chief bureaucrat on domestic policy. The president oversees the military, yes, oversees the federal bureaucracy. And the courts have said the president has the power to grant proclamations, memoranda, and that he can also make shifts within existing policy of laws already passed. So, for example, we're in Utah. 1906, the Antiquities Act was passed by a Republican Congress, and a very happy Republican president was happy to be able to start doing things that would eventually, for example, create Bryce and Zion national parks. President Obama created the Bears Ears National Monument. 20 years before, Bill Clinton with Grand Staircase Escalante. A definition, a policy directive that implements or interprets an existing law, existing federal law, or a constitutional provision, or a U.S. treaty. So an executive order does not require the approval of Congress. Executive orders set policy while avoiding public debates and opposition. They have status of being new law once they appear in the Federal Register, which is a bureaucratic process. They can be used to implement many diverse actions. Examples. This is how executive orders have been used. Remember I mentioned 1794, George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion. Sends troops into Ohio to stop a domestic rebellion. That's the first time that's ever been done in our history. Now, I've lived through 2 states of emergency, one during the Vietnam War and one during the greatest civil race riot in American history. If you remember 1992, end of April, beginning of May, Los Angeles, I was down there on University of Utah business. I can still remember the orange black skies. If you know Southern California pretty well, can you imagine driving from Pasadena to Santa Monica on the freeways in 35 minutes and never see a policeman? I did that. Okay? It was a very dangerous time. And then the other was during the Vietnam War in 1970. 1861, President Lincoln sends troops into South Carolina to protect a federal fort. The American Civil War is an undeclared war. It's not a formally declared war. It's a civil war. I suggest to you that the worst kind of war, except for a nuclear war, is a civil war. Because you have brother against brother, father against son, so forth. And that's what we have. You know, my whole family is from Texas. I'm the one living up here among you wild folks. And I go down to Texas, and folks there say, "Timmy, why are you talking that Yankee talk? You're talking all that Yankee talk." 1942, President Roosevelt approved internment camps for Japanese Americans. We know something about this. We have a camp here in this state, don't we? Just opened up a museum there. I've spent a lot of time in Japan. My daughter-in-law is from Japan, and I am a grandpa of a young lady who speaks to me both in Japanese and English. You know, what Franklin Roosevelt did in 1942 is considered probably the second worst decision ever made, certainly in the Supreme Court decision that upholds that legality 2 years later. In 1947, after World War II, Harry Truman establishes loyalty review boards for federal workers, loyalty oaths. This is executive order. This wasn't an act of Congress. 1977, Jimmy Carter granted total amnesty to Vietnam War draft evaders. That's over 10,000. I was there in 77, January 20th, on a cold day for the inauguration of President Carter. And then right after he walked a mile and a half to the White House, reviewed the parade, and he granted by executive order that full and complete amnesty for those folks living in Sweden or in Canada, trying to bring closure to the Vietnam War, which had ended 2 years before, April 30th, 1975. Lastly, 2003, President George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security. He didn't do that by act of Congress, he did it by executive order. It's the greatest reorganization of the federal bureaucracy since the 1947 National Security Act that created the CIA, renamed the Defense Department, and created the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. Okay, I've got lots of wonkish notes here, so I'm not going to bombard you with all these, but I do want you to know this for comparison and contrast. That is that Congress, which convened just after New Year's this year, before January 20th, has introduced 7,173 bills as of yesterday. 7,173 bills and resolutions currently pending in Congress. Okay. Congress, as of today, has passed 68 bills. The vast majority of them renaming this post office after that person. One bill I like is to put a man or a woman on Mars by 2030. How much money was appropriated by Congress to do that? Zero. None. But still it was a bill that passed. My point here is there were 13 major proposals for lawmaking during the campaign last year. Of those 13 major proposals, how many have become law? None. None. The only one that's come close to passing was healthcare reform. Question, how many executive orders as of today has the current president issued?
Too many.
Too many. Okay, a quantifiable answer would be exactly 50. So 50 executive orders, 68 bills passed. Okay, just to compare. So you can see how the public might be angry at Congress for inability to function, to perform its lawmaking duties. And you can see why the current president might say he's been an activist, that he's been as active, in a sense, as the Congress. Okay, almost a Q&A. That word filibuster, extended debate. You know what it is. It's only in the Senate. It's not in the House. When did it arrive? Is it in the Constitution? No. It's a rule. It's a Senate rule that the Senate passed back in 1837 after years of discussion and debate. And the Senate has had that rule. They've sculptured it. They've changed it a number of times over the years. At one time, for example, 1964, remember the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the first major Civil Rights Act, 100 years after the Civil War? You had to have, you had to invoke cloture. You had to get 75 votes out of 100. Now it's 60. So major change there, from 3/4 to 3/5. That was major change. And as you know, there's been some serious discussion about making a change so the Senate would be like the House, basically 50+1. Isn't that what the Senate did when it changed its rules, specifically with regard to the final vote of Justice Gorsuch? Wasn't 60, ended up being 50, well, would have been 51-52. Right now the Senate is split along party lines, 52-48. Cloture, you shut down the filibuster extended debate. When was it invoked? The year that the U.S. entered the European War, the war to end wars, World War I, the First World War. In order to get something done to try to deal with this war in which the U.S. was entering a war that was already underway for 3 years, they had to break the filibuster of those who were opposed to entry, and so you have the cloture rule. Okay, regular order, I kind of alluded to it. Remember your textbook. How does a bill become a law? Remember the little cartoon that you may have seen? Okay, okay. You can submit an idea for a law to your House member or senator, okay? Your House member or your senator. And then that'll be written up in legalese. It'll be introduced to the House, introduced in the Senate, money bills in the House, foreign policy bills in the Senate. It's assigned by leadership to a standing committee. It goes to a subcommittee. It's going to have to come through a subcommittee process. You mark up a bill, edit it, then the standing committee, and if it approves, gets approval from the state subcommittee and standing committee on to the floor for House floor action, and Senate floor action has to pass in identical forms. We'll call that regular order. Do you remember at 2 o'clock in the morning, East Coast time, a few weeks ago, on the health care reform bill, that John McCain walked in and then he put thumbs down, and that vote went down with his vote, and he was saying, you know, he had a major scar over his forehead, that he wanted regular order. This is what he's talking about. Rather than have a situation where, for example, last May, when my students were scheduled to meet with Senator Lee in his office in Russell, in 361A Russell, that Senator Lee couldn't meet with us because his behind-the-scenes, closed-door meeting on health care reform was going longer than they thought. So Senator Lee could not meet with us. Question was transparency. You had 15 members of the same political party who happened to be in the majority meeting behind closed doors, and this was what was happening. It wasn't regular order. There wasn't a public process. This is what was upsetting to John McCain. The sequester. What is a sequester? Sequestration? It's a rule. It's a process that the Senate and House has imposed upon itself when they cannot do their homework on time by a certain date. Then what automatically happens is that there is a freeze, and the money spent is going to be that of a certain percentage as before. I should use my exact words here. Process that sets hard dollar caps on government spending. If Congress approves a dollar spending amount above the caps, then automatically and across the board spending cut is imposed on all federal government departments and programs by an equal percentage. Where this really hurts some folks is in the Pentagon, in the military. Because if you think about the federal budget, 84% to 85% of the federal budget is military, military related, and benefits that all of us receive from entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, student loans, and veterans benefits. The remaining 15 to 16% is everything else you can imagine. So if you're talking about transportation or education, anything like that, it's all within that 15 to 16%. If you're going to have major cuts, you have to do it military, military related, and entitlements. And we're in debt $20 trillion. $20 trillion. Imagine how that number will go up if we have a nuclear war with North Korea. Okay? Lastly, vetoes. Remember presidential vetoes? And we can talk about it, congressional vetoes, pocket veto, and line item veto. And this is specified in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2. So now I'm going to stop and drink some water and look for the first question. I've thrown a lot of wonkish information, and I see a question right there.
Well, I don't even know where to start. First of all, you know that the League of Women Voters has long had a position for a direct election of the president. But we have this electoral college, and I've heard that they could have met and declared the popular vote winner the winner. Why haven't they ever done this?
Talking about they being
The electoral college.
the Electoral College, okay? And keep in mind, who are the electors?
The electors?
Remember, the Electoral College is not Westminster College. So, yeah, so to be an elector, and it's specified in the Constitution, okay? This is it's like an appointment, a temporary appointment, in which they meet around the second week of December. Years ago, you had to meet in person. Now with modern technology, it's a teleconference. So who are the electors? It's only person for a one-time performance. Okay, it has to be a person who is not a federal government official, a person who doesn't hold any position in the federal government. It cannot be a House member or senator. It's usually a person chosen by now the political parties, prominent political parties. Give you an example. 1996, when Clinton was reelected, defeating Dole, something like 49, 41, and then 9% for Ross Perot. I had a camera crew from Channel 9, because I was doing my Constitution telecourse, up at the state capitol for the counting of Utah's, at that time, 5 electoral votes. Remember, winner-take-all system. And I remember Chris Cannon, who had just defeated Bill Orton, but he was still private citizen Chris Cannon. He was not Congressman Chris Cannon. He came up to me and said, you know, Bob Dole's too liberal for me. I'd vote no if I could. Olene Walker was the lieutenant governor, and by definition then and today, the state state elections officer. She heard that. She came over to him and said, Chris, I'm going to have to replace you if you have ideas of not voting the way the voters of Utah did. Winner take all. Bob Dole would get all 5 Utah's electoral votes. So with that in mind, Chris Cannon voted for Bob Dole, even though he didn't want to, but because he was an appointed elector for that one occasion. So really, I'm going to suggest to you, electors really don't have that much power. The way we have to resolve this, we can either do it fully, completely by constitutional amendment, but that's a hard process. We've had over 11,000 proposed constitutional amendments, and we have how many? 27. And remember, the first 10 grouped together, because there were more proposals, grouped together collectively as 10, the Bill of Rights. That's 1791, December 15th. So since 1791, December 15th, we've had 17 more. The last one was 1992, and it was actually a proposal by James Madison way back when. And that one simply is that if someone like Mike Lee is elected to the Senate, he cannot, and he votes for a pay raise, he cannot receive that pay raise until he's reelected. That was a big issue at the beginning of the Republic, and that's our last one, 1992. So we have 27 amendments. So if you hear something like the Equal Rights Amendment or the budget, Balanced Budget Amendment, those are proposals. Proposals. So constitutional amendment, you can do it incrementally, and we have 2 case studies, Maine and Nebraska. Best example this last time around was Maine. Maine has, every state has two senators. Maine has 2 House members. And Maine and Nebraska, by congressional district, the candidate for president who gets the most votes gets that 1 vote from that individual congressional district. So, in Maine, last November 8th, Hillary Clinton got the most votes overall in the state of Maine. But in the 2nd congressional district, the one that's to the north, that's much more in the woods, more rural, her opponent got more votes in that district than she did. So he got 1 vote, she got 3. Instead of 4, she got 3 from Maine. So in other words, what I'm saying to you is incrementally, we could move in that direction. It's hard getting a constitutional amendment approved. Very difficult. Yes, please.
Would that electoral college change then be state by state, where the states set the increments or the winner take all?
Yeah.
And that would be a constitutional convention in each state.
Okay. Now, each state with a state legislative body can make that decision. Utah could change its rules, but I don't imagine the Utah State Legislature is going to do that. But you can see that at least there's 2 examples now of where incrementally we could make progress that way. You want to follow up?
Follow-up, don't you think that one of the main reasons why there is no big push to change or get rid of the electoral college is because it suits candidates where they can focus their campaigns to garner votes?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would say also, historically, of the 5 out of 45 candidates who have won in the Electoral College after not getting the most votes were members of the Republican Party. In the one time it was arguably the Democratic Party was really 1824, and that was really the Democratic Republicans. You had 4 candidates who were all self-identified as Democratic Republicans, hyphenated. And that was supposedly during the era of good feelings. It was really the era of bad feelings, but era of good feelings. So you had 4 Democratic Republicans running, and Andrew Jackson barely missed getting a majority of the electoral votes. And his supporters won the House and Senate. When the matter went to the House of Representatives, where each state, this is in the Constitution, Article 1, each state has 1 vote, like Wyoming would have 1 vote, California would have 1 vote. John Quincy Adams won because he was someone the delegates felt more comfortable with rather than that rowdy guy, Andy Jackson. So for 4 years, John Quincy Adams was president as a Democratic Republican, but life was hell for him. And I should say that in the textbooks, it usually refers to John Quincy Adams as a failure as president. I always thought he did a pretty good job. His proposals, for example, I wish we had meters rather than yards. That was his proposal. Yeah. And also a national military academy. That came after his presidency. And a national highway, national interstate highway system. Smithsonian Museum, a national museum. These are his ideas. So when I take my students on a tour of the old House of Representatives, now called Statuary Hall, and sometimes, like in PBS NewsHour interviews, you'll see Statuary Hall in the background. I always take them over to his desk, where the disc in the floor is there. It has his name because of former House members that became presidents. They have those discs, like former Congressman Abraham Lincoln and former Congressman John Quincy Adams, who together opposed U.S. entry into the Mexican War. And I bring that up because my students know nothing about the Mexican War except my Latino students. You're sitting on land that was Mexican land until we stole it from the Mexicans. So, there.
So when you're talking about removal from office with regard to Trump, seems to me that he's more than met the qualifications. If you're going to stay lying, for example, since you mentioned Richard Nixon, so that he could be removed from office or high crimes and misdemeanors. What is it that is preventing some rush to remove him from office, given the fact that he is gunning down the presidency and the country that goes with it?
Really good question. We're waiting for the methodical investigation to conclude with Robert Mueller. He's got at least 15 very well-respected lawyers who are investigators, especially with money. And remember, Robert Mueller is in the same position that Archibald Cox was back in 1973. And I've had this hand shook hands with Archie Cox. And you remember the Saturday Night Massacre, October 20th, 1973. And that really, really starts to bring the downfall to Richard Nixon. Now, I think just yesterday or the day before, the current president said he was not planning to fire or try to fire the special counsel, but that he wished that the whole investigation would end. I'm sure he would like the investigation to end because it's going to lead to his downfall. Not his personality, not his differences on public policy issues. It's going to be treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors, lying. That's what's going to bring him down. Now, why aren't the Democrats, Congresswoman Waters from South Central has been out in front since the beginning, but the Democrats know that with the current president, the Republican agenda is not going to be enacted. Not going to happen. Not unless there's a lot of compromises, which might happen if Pence is suddenly Vice President Pence becomes President Pence, you're going to see a lot of things sail through the House and Senate that the Democratic Party would not like to have. Therefore, they're looking ahead to November next year. And really, I'm going to suggest to you, as we saw last night with Ben McAdams, the midterm election campaign for 2018 is well underway now. And there's a fellow named Bannon who's really helping the Democrats in his own curious way. So, I would suggest that combination of the ongoing investigation, which is methodical. Remember, he's an FBI director for 12 years. Okay, the FBI, in contrast to the CIA, FBI methodically moves towards building a case in which they can win. Whereas the CIA, and I've taken my students to Langley a lot of times since '94, they're out for information. They're not interested in going to trial. You know, they want information that they can plot strategies. So, so I would suggest that every day is an ongoing drama. Here, yes, follow up.
So how do you see Mitch McConnell and his relationship or running the Republican Party, if you want to make that argument, that he has a chokehold on how the Republican Party.
He was elected in '84. Senator Bennett, and I worked with Senator Bennett for 4 years on a wonderful Hinckley Institute seminar, said to me that, and Senator Bennett held a leadership position under Mitch McConnell. Senator Bennett said that Mitch McConnell told him that he wanted to be majority leader. And when the opportunity presented itself, he had been extracting promises, IOUs in a sense, from Republican colleagues. You know, quid pro quos. I scratch your back, you scratch my back. Okay, so forth. And so he started over 2 years ahead of time, anticipating an opening as majority leader, and he got it. He was so much more methodical, but so was a fellow named Lyndon Johnson, who was elected to the Senate in '48, and then when in '53, in his first term, he became Senate Majority Leader. But it might have been because Lyndon Johnson knew where the cash was, all that Texas oil money, oil and gas money. But Mitch McConnell knows the rules, right down to the bureaucratic details. I sat in the gallery last year for several hours, and I watched Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. They were masterful with the rules, you know, and you couldn't tell from C-SPAN because the TV cameras can't move. You know, you'd think the whole place was filled, you know, but they were, you know, going through the bureaucratic process of lawmaking, so my suggestion is he's probably going to be there for a while because he has so many IOUs. Also, who is the Secretary of Labor? I think it's the Secretary of Labor. His wife. Korean American, his wife. See, he's very well connected. A lot of folks you know, have favors. Just like, you know who the scheduling person is for President Trump is Senator Hatch's former chief of staff. You know, the traffic cop, the person who keeps the schedule. So, yes. Hand over here.
I'm just curious, how can we get rid of these guys? All of them. McConnell, his wife, Trump, all of them. What do we do?
I have a friend who spent some time in Vietnam. He has an answer, but I'm not going to repeat it. The answer is how to remove the people who are in power right now. And the answer is, in a peaceful, traditional, governmental way, we have a process called elections. But that requires people to register and vote. And you know, and you are all about doing that. You know, and think about all the years in the past, going up back to about 1984 or 88, that you handled the presidential debates, until that was basically taken away by the two major political parties who wanted to keep control, because it was all about control, the two big parties. But it comes down to power, and the way you remove them is by everybody registering and then voting. I was in Australia 4 years ago, and there in Australia, which is a continent nation, everybody's required to vote, register and vote. And if you don't, you get dinged financially, just like you're expected to pay your taxes. You know, to me, it's basic good citizenship. So when I preach the gospel of registering and voting to my large classes and find out that they've got other things on their mind, you know, they've got this, which is almost a drug. Or they're thinking about her or him, or Facebook, social media, or, and this is a real problem, we now have more non-traditional students than traditional students. You know, the definitions have flip-flopped, okay? My kids right out of Judge Memorial went to school, my son to Texas, my daughter went to Utah, and they finished in 4 years. That's the tradition. Now that's the untraditional. Now it's a transfer student or somebody who has taken another course of action before coming to the university. And the average time is 6 years, not 4 years. So that there are definite changes. Well, so many of my students are students, employees, parents, and spouses. When do they sleep? Not much. And then they get grouchy. And they expect an A, but they don't want to study for an A. Yeah. But they'll complain and moan and groan, to try to get the A. And then some of them cheat, which is illegal. When I talk to some of them about this, I get a little puddle on the floor, So this is a dilemma that we're facing right now. So, the very back.
How did gerrymandering become
Okay.
accepted?
Okay, and we use the term gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry was, in 1812, the governor of Massachusetts, and he wanted his political interest, he's a Boston Brahmin, to maintain power. So he saw to it that the legislature under his control drew the districts so they looked like slithering creatures, snakes, Gila monsters, rather than squares and rectangles. Now, Elbridge Gerry, go back to the Constitutional Convention. Remember I said the vote was 38-3 to ratify? He was one of the three. He opposed, he stayed to the very end, he didn't leave, and he voted no to ratify this new Constitution, the second one, to replace the first, which was the Articles of Confederation, if you remember that. And I was talking to, so I was going to tell you a lurid story about him, but I won't. So, oh, come on. So apparently he was with his mistress in a coach going to his offices when he suddenly died at age 70, which was considered old back then, very young now. So that's when it emerges. Now, you're dealing with imperfect human beings. And what do politicians want? They want continued political life. They want re-election. Now, you have this wonderful booklet that you have been signing on here. And I brought my copy just in case you were forgetful, and I'm shameless, And when it was submitted to the Lieutenant Governor's office, the state elections officer, for his approval, I was one of the 5 signatories. So it was an honor to do that. In 2011, after the 2010 census, I was one of the 7 members of the Salt Lake County Citizens Advisory Commission. I was vice chair. So when the chair wasn't there, I was conducting the meetings for a year. We drew districts that looked like squares and rectangles for Salt Lake County, which was 40 to 41% of our state's population. Meanwhile, the legislature spent $110,000, 13 months, had meetings throughout the state, and then went behind closed doors for 2 days with computers coming from Washington, D.C., basically, and came up with the districts that we have today. So I consider that fairly undemocratic. But it all comes down to power and money, money and power. Co-chair of the Better Boundaries Commission is Ralph Becker. Ralph and I together worked for Governor Matheson years ago. And Ralph said to me one day that in the 10 years that he served in the state legislature, the number one issue that was the most volatile and the most distressing for him was this matter of redrawing districts to maintain power. And he said he was really disappointed in a lot of his Democratic colleagues. You know, the Republicans he understood, but his Democratic colleagues the same. And he said he got punished, he barely got reelected. Patrice Arendt, if you may recall, they drew a line from her house down one side of her street and destroyed her district. So, and this goes back to after the census in 2000. So in 2001, her district was drawn. So what did she do? She decided not to run for re-election in the House. She ran for the state Senate, which most of her district was in the new state Senate district. And her opponent was the incumbent Republican from the Holiday area, Mill Creek Holiday area, who was the Senate Majority Leader. And there was one debate. There was supposed to be a number of them. It was at the Hinckley Institute in the caucus room. And I'm an old high school college debater, and I've attended a lot of debates. The one debate I remember in which I really felt sorry for the person being destroyed was the Senate Majority Leader, because if you know Patrice, her work ethic, you know, and her intelligence, and she just destroyed this man, so that it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing because she had all the Senate and House bill numbers memorized and everything, and he was blindsided. He thought he was the incumbent. He was going to win election easily against a woman who was a woman, a Democrat, and Jewish. You know, and that was the first and last debate, and she won 60-40. So you can do it in Utah. You can do it in Utah. Yes, please. Oh, you know what? I always look for the new hand, and I'll come back to you, okay?
Can you give us some perspective? I'm sure you can. This just looks like a terrible crisis to us embroiled in the federal system right now. Have we ever been in this much trouble and gotten out of it?
In my lifetime, I've never seen our country as divided as this. Now, I remember something called the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. I went to the high school Jackie Robinson went to, so I was a minority. The Vietnam War, my dad was a pilot in the European theater, and we'd have some conversations in which the veins in our foreheads would come out. And then, of course, there was Richard Nixon and Watergate. And I was an intern on Capitol Hill and a staffer for Congressman Wayne Owens, who was on the House Judiciary Committee. So those are three examples of when the country was very divided on those public policy issues. In my lifetime, I've never seen us so divided. And the fact is, it's a very dangerous world, not just for the possibility of nuclear weapons, but also look at the immigration crisis. We haven't seen a migration crisis since the 1945, 46, 47, end of World War II. Just about 2 years ago, I was in Italy. I saw a lot of folks in Italy who didn't look like they were born and raised in Italy, but they had made it to Italy. And in June, I was in Germany and Austria and Czech Republic, and the same thing. Very close to Greece. Very close, and of course, we just have a new leader, 31 years old, elected in Austria, and this is bringing up some hardcore issues. Because remember, desperate people, as Thoreau said, desperate people will do desperate things. Now, people in the world, if they are free, really free, legally and illegally, where are they going to come? They come here. They come here. We're the third most populous country in the world after China and India. And we have about 30% of the world's natural wealth. We have life pretty good here, yet we've got a few problems. Boy, I've been in places where people have some real problems. Desperation. So we have the potential for two unstable people in North Korea and the US to put us in a nuclear war. And we also have desperate people in the world. And then the conflicts. I spent some time in Venezuela. I wouldn't be surprised to wake up any morning and hear that there's civil war in the streets of Caracas and Maracaibo. You know, that's not too far away from the Florida Keys. You know, and so I'll stop here. Like I say, I just, in my awareness, and like I say, I'm a baby boomer. You know, and oldest of 5. So I had a lot of conversations with my dad about the world and traveled a little bit. And I say, things are scary. And we should be very alarmed. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to have a good night's sleep. You know, the best wealth is health. So, yes.
Can you tell us something good about Citizens United and about its future?
That it was peacefully decided. 5-4, January 2010. You asked for something good about it. This is enough to drive a man to drink here. It overturned over a century of campaign finance law. It has made it so that a Las Vegas hotel billionaire can be somebody who can give countless millions in different sheltered ways to a candidate. When Mitt Romney got the Republican Party nomination in 2012, he had a half-hour meeting with Sheldon Adelron, yeah, in Las Vegas. Did you have a half-hour meeting with Mitt Romney? I didn't either, but Mitt Romney did with him. How did that happen? Because money talks. You know, we're talking about elections being bought and sold. Yeah, and
What about the problem with the voting and the believability of the outcomes? It seems as if people are almost afraid to vote now because they think the machines don't actually work correctly.
okay. Try to make this a short answer. If we go back to 2000, remember Bush versus Gore? When we conduct an election, historically it was with a piece of paper and a pencil, maybe ink. When we have a presidential election, it's not one election, it's 51 elections. And within each state, it's not one election, it's, in Texas, 254 elections, county by county. In Utah, it's 29 county elections. And then the county clerks, like Sherry Swinson from Salt Lake, sends the results up, you know, to Spencer Cox. What happened in 2000, we remember it very well. And ultimately, it's always a test question for my students. The Supreme Court, on a 5-4 decision, the only court cited in Article 3 of the Constitution, determined who the leader would be of the country under Article 2. George Washington was right at the Constitutional Convention when he was presiding officer, and he said, what we are creating here is an experiment in democracy. It's an experiment. And again, this was a case where the person who didn't get the most votes was determined to be the president, when ultimately Al Gore Jr. stepped aside. And that was after 36 days. Now, right after that, I was in India with Ted Wilson and a group of students. And a government official from the federal government in New Delhi was talking about how it took a month, 30 days, for them to determine their nationwide elections. And before thinking, I gasped and said, wow, a whole month. And he said, well, yours took 36 days. Pow! Pow. He was quick on the uptake on that one. Okay. So we try to learn from our mistakes. So that was December 12th of 2000. So in 2002, after much debate, Congress passed HAVA, capital letters HAVA, Help America Vote Act. And so long story short, federal dollars go to states, and a place like Utah has touch screen voting in all 29 counties. And that's the same in Florida. Remember, Florida had different ways of voting in each county? And so you had hanging chads in some counties and not in other counties. Because when states are thinking where can they balance their budget, where can they cut corners saving money, and one way was conducting elections, even though an election is very important, strategically important to our democracy. But state of Florida, which is now our third largest state, was caught in that dilemma. So here we are in a situation still trying to determine what is a fair and open election. In January, prior to the beginning of the Utah legislative session, the fourth Monday in January, Representative Arendt couldn't go up to a meeting of lawmakers because she had another conflict, so she asked me to go. So I went up there, and we were meeting with county clerks. And the county clerks were explaining to the lawmakers why Utah elections are honest, totally transparent, honest, no corruption. Now, there were legislators there, and one, Todd Weiler from Davis County, was very suspicious that somehow, some way, there had to be potential for corruption, that somehow people who were not qualified to vote were voting. And yet there was no proof to support that suspicion or allegation. So, and yet, after the election, you may remember someone saying that he would have won the state of New Hampshire if millions of people had not voted illegally. And the Republican Secretary of State in New Hampshire said, not true. So this is a dilemma we face right now. So I go back to my Australia concept. Everybody should be registered to vote, and everybody should vote, and they get dinged financially if they don't. It's the basic action of good citizenship, is a vote, because elections matter. We see it every day. We see it in these 50 executive orders that are almost the flip side, contrary to the previous administration. Did I answer the question? It's a long answer.
I know the answer, it's just that I don't have to convince everybody.
Well, if I were Shogun, dictator, king, so forth, I'd have certain ways to do it. Yeah. There was right there.
Can we talk about the Second Amendment and how it's being interpreted these days?
I have a dachshund at home, so that's my quick answer to the Second Amendment. Okay. The Supreme Court had stayed away from this issue until 1939 and then revisited it in 2009 and 2010. So that now, as a result, we have more guns in our country than we have people. We have about 326 million people. We have more than that number of guns. Tonight's Thursday night. Saturday at 1:30, I'm going to be alone in the University of Utah football stadium with 46,000 other people. That's the number of people we lose each year to suicides and homicides by guns. More people die of suicides than homicides each year with a gun. We average more than one mass killing a day. A mass killing with a gun is 4 or more people a day. We average more than one mass killing a day with a gun. Statistic, I remember, I'm not sure if it's true now, is that 1 out of 43 times a person inside his apartment, his home, his condo, with a gun protects himself from the bad guy. 1 out of 43 times. 42 out of 43 times, it's the lover's quarrel. It's the husband and wife who have a disagreement. It's the kid, Danny Mays, that I remember in elementary school, who killed his best friend because they were playing Russian roulette. It's the daughter of my medical doctor who delivered my daughter, who his own daughter, home alone, found the key to the lockbox and got access to a gun, loaded it, and shot herself in the abdomen after 7 years suffering with migraine headaches. So she put herself out of her misery in a terrible way. So these are data. Oh, veterans. We lose 22 veterans a day to guns. Suicides. The dachshund? My dachshund is eternally vigilant. She barks at me when I come home. I had this I-thou conversation with her about the fact that I pay for her dog food. But she still feels it's her role to let everybody know that there is somebody entering the house. So, most burglaries occur during the daytime, not at nighttime, when people are not home. So, anyway, I've got all these numbers in my head, they just flash on the screen. But when I talk to my students about it and they raise the question of gun control, I stop them right there and say, no, think problem solution. And that's what the Second Amendment's really about. Think problem solution. Think problem, gun violence. And I just gave you some numbers to illustrate gun violence. Possible solutions, one is gun control. I like the one that goes back to when I was a little kid in Houston, and we had 2 television stations. And they had these Flash Gordon serials that my father watched during the Great Depression. And you'd have the guy with a ray gun. A ray gun? Now, the purpose is to immobilize somebody. Nothing invasive. No one's not going to be killed. But you immobilize the person. Person overheats, wants to strip off clothes, can't do anything, immobilized. That's my solution. And you would say, oh, that's science fiction, Tim. But I know, going back to 1973, that the Pentagon, doing its R&D, has been working on it that long, at least 44 years. They haven't come up with something yet. Oh, they have tasers, tasers. But people die with tasers, don't they? They can die. And this is magic, isn't it? Who would have thought somebody who dropped out of college and working part-time in an apple orchard would come up with this? Boy, do I underutilize it. I have to talk to my granddaughter about, she's almost 32 months, about how to use this fully. She's called Japan before. But the law says that you can own an individual person can own a gun in the District of Columbia or in an individual state. We're out in the West. This state, to an extent, was settled with the use of a gun. I'm just thinking there's got to be a better way for law enforcement and for individual citizens to behave and not have the mass killings that we have. Didn't we just have one either yesterday or today in the suburbs of Maryland, suburbs of Washington, D.C.? And you get to a point where you're almost numb. You almost take it in stride, like, oh, this is routine. It shouldn't be routine. I have had international students live in my home since 1980, 22 different countries. This year, for a month, a medical doctor from Ghana, that was last month. Month before, a medical doctor from Egypt, who was studying at the University of figure out to find new ways for brain tumors. I had a student until last May live with me for 4 years from China, young lady a year ago, 6 years from Japan. Each of them asked, what's going on in this country? This would never happen in our country. These mass killings. And it's hard for me to explain it to them, just like it's hard for me to explain why the winner of the election doesn't win the election. There's some anomalies here. So I saw there was a hand over here, and then I'll circle back. Yeah. Well, there are 4 sections to it. Which one are you interested in? It was ratified in 1967, January. It took that long, more than 3 years after John Kennedy's death, to come up with the 25th Amendment. And we have used it, the first time we used it was actually October 10th, 1973, Thursday. Spiro T. Agnew, remember him? Yeah, during the Watergate scandal. And he said he would not resign if indicted, and then he went into Baltimore, into federal court with his lawyer, and pleaded no contest to tax evasion. Remember Al Capone? Tax evasion. Tax evasion on what? The cash that he took in brown paper bags during the years that he was governor, which continued to come to him in the White House, because he was giving special favors to building contractors in Maryland. And he could have spent the rest of his life in federal prison. But the 25th Amendment allowed him an out. He could resign peacefully and stay out of prison, pay $100,000 back in back taxes, 3 years unsupervised probation. But all that evidence, 44 legal pages, had to be published so you could see that he was on the take. And the reason why he was allowed to get off through the 25th Amendment was because Richard Nixon was going through his own scandal. Can you imagine during the Cold War and the Vietnam War to have the president and the vice president both going under investigations? That was the crisis we faced. It was amazing. But when you asked me the question, what was it exactly about the 25th Amendment? How does it apply to this particular president? He could die. And I mean that seriously. He is my height. I'm 6'2" and shrinking. I wanted to be 6'7", but my 6'5" father married a 5'2" woman. Big mistake. Big mistake. When you're trying to swing between forward and guard, it's just a big mistake. And he's my height, and he's 75 pounds heavier than I am. And he doesn't sleep well, and he has a fairly abrasive temper. So you put those factors together, and he's 71. So I don't rule that out. I've run this by my medical doctor friends, and they say, don't rule it out. Here today, dead tomorrow. And so if that were to happen, Vice President Pence would take office under the 25th Amendment. That's also specified in Article 2 of the Constitution, but the 25th Amendment is much more clear in terms of presidential disability. What if the president lives, but he's disabled? Okay. I'm a desperate man. I'll use movies when, if I can't pull up a quick historical fact. The movie The American President is cute, it's kind of funny, and it uses the 25th Amendment. If you saw that movie. So, yes.
You mentioned the United States being the third most
Populous.
wealthy, most.
No, we're the wealthiest. We have about 30% of the world's estimated wealth. Well, we look at the size of this country, and we're basically the size of China and the size of Canada. And then we look at our natural resources. We are really, as a nation, very blessed with natural resources. Well, as a result, it makes us the wealthiest country in the world. Yeah, basically anything that's in the ground. Okay? But we also have a strategic location. We're not too far north, not too far south. We have a climate that's very attractive most of the year. Most of the year.
I'm thinking about the underground resources not being so much of a blessing anymore.
Well, you have some folks in the legislature who are trying to find a way to pay bills without raising taxes, without assigning a head tax on folks with large families. By the way, I proposed this years ago when I was an intern. Boy, they could have thrown me out of the building, you know. I thought it was pretty logical, you know. Pay for what you produce. And so we're not going to have a head tax. We're not going to increase the utility franchise taxes. Fossil fuels, we're not going to do that. So what do? Let's sue the federal government, win, and dig up the ground, and we'll find whatever underneath the ground, and that will pay our bills. I'm simplifying it, but that's what I've heard, and that's what I've been told. That there's a lot of vast wealth underneath the ground. So, well, you know, and remember, let's see, we're in this valley. Isn't there a copper mine up there? And wasn't there silver over there? There's gold out in Lindar Hills somewhere. Oh, in the Great Salt Lake? Let's go mine that. When you fly into this valley, you see the Great Salt Lake with different colors. And when you stand at Dead Horse Point and look out at this beautiful panorama, you still see something that's man-made. So, yes, please.
So, what do you think about the two-party system? Good or bad? And if it's not so good, the future of other possibilities.
Okay. Two-party system. The debate last night. I'm so glad Jim Bennett was one of 8 candidates, but the third one barely allowed by the commission to participate in the debate. Thank you. So, and I thought he was very articulate in explaining his public policy positions, but also his strategic position between the established Democratic and Republican parties. Since the 1790s, we've had 71 political parties in which candidates were formal candidates, paid money to be candidates, and received votes as candidates. 71 different political parties. We think of the Democratic Party, which was the it emerged as the anti-federalist, became the Democratic Republicans, and then in 1832, they have a national convention. Democratic Party. We think of the Republican Party today is not the part of the Democratic Republican Party of 1824. It emerges as an anti-slavery party in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act being passed. The chief sponsor was a fellow named Stephen Douglas. And so you have some folks like a former member of the Whig Party, tall, lanky guy, no beard, from Illinois, who joins this new political party called the Republican Party. And lo and behold, in 1856, the newly created Republican Party, anti-slavery party. That's not to say they're supportive of abolition. They just don't want they want slavery to spread. You have a lot of racists in the Republican Party. But John C. Fremont almost wins the election. He's a war hero, Mexican War. And then in 1860, Abe Lincoln wins. No sooner is he in office than his old political rival from the Senate race in 1858 in Illinois, Stephen Douglas, dies. So Abraham Lincoln, to honor his old political rival from Illinois, named some military camp way out west somewhere after Stephen Douglas. you think back on recent times when in 1996, 1992, 1980, we had 4 major candidates running. But historically what has happened is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have absorbed the main reasons for this independent party to rise and to continue to exist. Preempts if you want, co-ops if you want. And so if you don't, and very often a new movement has benefits but then suffers from only having a leader and not having broad infrastructure. Ross Perot comes out here in 1992 twice, so I followed him around twice. Got a bumper sticker that says Ross the Boss, which my son loves because his name is Ross. So it went right on his door. You know? And so we're in this dilemma that Jim Bennett was articulating last night. I thought he did the best in the debate last night. You know, total eye contact, spoke with passion and compassion, and knowledgeable on the issues. Pardon me?
But he won't win.
But this time around, he probably won't win. But, you know, I always think, never give up. You know, I think of Winston Churchill in 1940, June, you know. Great speech. You know, he's just become prime minister. He comes up to the podium. You know, England stands alone. We're giving Lend-Lease. We're lending and leasing weapons to England. Do you think we're going to get them back? And he comes up to the podium, looks at everybody, and he says, in his accent, never give up. And he walks away and comes back and says, never. And he repeats it 2 more times and then sits down. Do you think the audience got his essential message? England survived. So I always I'm an optimist by nature. I have to be. Otherwise, the suicide count would increase seriously. You're right. Right. You have to be optimistic. You know, I've got a good friend who's been married and divorced 3 times, and I asked him, what did he learn? He said, I've learned there are no guarantees. Uh-oh, you're coming this way.
I am.
You are.
I do have one final question.
Yes.
Why do you personally think the redistricting petition is important for Utah?
Wow. Do we have another 2 hours?
I'll sit down.
I believe in democracy. I believe we should have a system where elected officials remember that they're public servants and not our masters. I believe that public officials, elected officials, should be chosen by the voters, and they should not be allowed to choose their voters. The voters should choose them in a free, competitive election. I believe districts should look like squares and rectangles, and not like salamanders or snakes. I've said this in public, I say it to the press, I feel like there's a brooding omnipresence, but this is what I believe. I believe in competition. I grew up in a southern, evangelical, racist, right-wing conservative Republican family in downtown Houston, Texas, in the Heights. You know, and like I say, I'm the only one up here with you Yankees. You know. And I just, you know, having played sports, I believe in competition. And having played team sports, I believe in teamwork. I think that what the league is doing, what this initiative is all about, is really important to our democracy. You never give up. And if the time comes when we feel like the situation is hopeless and we cannot change, then boy, there's some Kool-Aid we can mix, you know. But that's my feeling. That's why I'm on my 3rd booklet. You know, I'm on my 3rd booklet. So thank you.
That's been terrific. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was incredible, and of course we could go on another couple of hours. We won't. I think if you'd like to speak, yes?
I was going to say,
Carol, want to come up?
One of the songs I like, Mick Jagger,
I think he's going to sing.
Start me up and I never stop, never stop.
Well, I was hoping you would sing. Carol, come on up for a minute. Don't leave quiet. I do want to say that we have several gentlemen in the audience. You are all welcome to become members of the League of Women Voters. We just leave women in the title because we've been the League of Women Voters for almost 100 years. So, Carol.
I think some of you heard me mention at our recent orientation meeting that way back in my early life, I took a class. It was called the Nixon Years, and it was from this gentleman. And I think now you understand why that course meant so much to me and why he holds me in the palm of his hand still. So thank you for being with us tonight, Professor Chambless.
You know, that was 1975.
I know.
Thank you, everybody. That's it.